For over 3 decades, international economists, global investors, and mainstream news outlets have used the exact same phrase to describe Nigeria, the sleeping giant of Africa. On paper, the nickname made perfect sense. Nigeria is home to over 220 million people, boasts Africa's largest demographic market, and sits on top of massive, multi-billion-dollar crude oil reserves. Its youth population is intensely entrepreneurial, and its commercial hubs pull in more venture capital than almost anywhere else on the continent. Yet, for just as long, the giant remains stubbornly asleep, paralyzed by systemic corruption, trapped in a volatile boom-and-bust cycle dictated entirely by global oil prices, and weighed down by highly restrictive regulatory frameworks. But over the last 2 to 3 years, a series of aggressive macroeconomic overhauls completely upended the country's economic foundation. Major structural reforms shook the institutional landscape. The national currency was unpegged, multi-billion-dollar domestic mega-refineries finally fired up, and global credit rating agencies took notice. In 2026, international ratings upgraded Nigeria's economic outlook to stable. From a high-level macroeconomic perspective, the giant is finally stirring. But if you zoom in from the headline figures to the microeconomic reality on the ground, a much darker picture emerges. The structural shifts that stabilize the government's balance sheets have left the average citizen facing a brutal, daily crisis of affordability. To understand whether Nigeria is actually charting a path towards sustainable global prominence, or if it is merely stepping into a different kind of economic trap, we have to look past the political rhetoric and analyze the raw, conflicting data of this transition.
I wish to make our position plain beyond any matter of doubt as regards the African continent. We in Nigeria appreciate the advantages which the size of our country and of its population give us, but we have absolutely no aggressive intentions.
Historically, the Nigerian government maintained 2 highly expensive economic illusions. First, it spent trillions of naira annually subsidizing cheap domestic petrol. Second, the Central Bank of Nigeria artificially pegged the value of the naira to the US dollar. While this kept consumer prices artificially low, it created a catastrophic fiscal drain. It depleted the nation's foreign reserves, discouraged authentic foreign direct investment, FDI, and fostered a massive black market. Elites and well-connected businesses could access cheap dollars at the official government rate and immediately flip them for a premium on the parallel market, pocketing an effortless arbitrage profit without producing anything of value. Faced with impending fiscal insolvency, the government initiated a program of economic shock therapy. They abruptly dismantled the fuel subsidy regime and allowed the naira to float freely based on international market demand. The immediate fallout was severe. The naira depreciated sharply, losing over 70% of its nominal value against the dollar in a matter of months. This currency collapse acted as an immediate inflationary transmission mechanism, driving headline inflation past 30% and triggering a severe cost of living crisis across urban and rural centers alike. However, looking strictly at institutional data, this aggressive surgery has accomplished its primary structural objective, preventing total fiscal collapse. By maintaining a highly aggressive, restrictive monetary policy, the Central Bank of Nigeria has finally begun to anchor the currency. The massive arbitrage gap between the official and parallel exchange rates has effectively closed, re-establishing a transparent, unified market. Driven by stronger current account balances and a sharp contraction in non-essential import demand, Nigeria's external reserves have rebounded toward the $50 billion threshold. Furthermore, a statistical rebasing of the nation's GDP updated the framework to more accurately capture modern high-growth sectors like digital financial services, e-commerce, and entertainment. This recalibration expanded nominal GDP metrics by over 34% to roughly $243.3 billion. On paper, the macroeconomic foundation has been reset. But this stabilization was achieved by transferring the fiscal burden directly onto the real sector and the civilian population. What makes Nigeria's current economic trajectory unique is that its resilience is no longer tethered entirely to the old crude oil production cycles. Even as oil output faced persistent technical and logistical challenges, real GDP growth has maintained a steady projection of 4.0% to 4.3%, heavily propelled by a highly dynamic non-oil private sector. The most prominent driver is the domestic financial technology ecosystem. Nigeria has firmly established itself as Africa's primary fintech capital. The rapid formalization of digital payment infrastructure has lowered systemic transaction friction, allowing small and medium-sized enterprises to scale operations outside the traditional, slow-moving banking framework. This digital transition has moved beyond basic payment processing into logistics tracking, tech-enabled agricultural supply chains, and localized business services. Simultaneously, the country's creative industries, specifically the global expansion of Afrobeats and the formalized distribution of Nollywood media assets, have transformed from informal cultural outputs into structured corporate sectors. These industries now actively attract foreign direct investment, generate substantial royalty inflows, and create high-value service sector employment for a tech-literate youth demographic. On the industrial side, the activation of major domestic refining assets has begun to reconfigure the nation's trade dynamics. For decades, Nigeria suffered from a bizarre economic paradox. It was a leading exporter of raw crude oil, yet it spent billions of dollars in foreign exchange importing refined petroleum products because its domestic state refineries were entirely non-functional. By pivoting toward large-scale domestic processing, the country is structurally reducing its reliance on foreign refined imports, a move intended to preserve foreign exchange and plug a massive historical trade deficit. Evaluating Nigeria solely through the lens of rising foreign reserves, fintech valuations, and mega-refineries creates a highly inaccurate, biased narrative. While the macroeconomic skeleton of the country is stabilizing, the real sector of the economy is under immense structural duress. To combat the inflation triggered by currency liberalization, the central bank deployed its primary monetary tool, raising the benchmark monetary policy rate to a restrictive 27%. While this aggressive tightening helped curb currency speculation and decelerate inflation, it has had severe collateral damage on local manufacturing and production. In an environment where the base policy rate is 27%, local businesses face commercial borrowing rates well exceeding 30%. This prohibitive cost of capital has effectively choked off domestic credit expansion for manufacturing. Compounded by the initial currency shocks and rising operational overhead, a notable corporate flight occurred. Multiple high-profile multinational manufacturing conglomerates, some of which had operated within the country for over half a century, shut down local operations or divested entirely. The cost of importing raw materials under a devalued naira, combined with exorbitant alternative energy costs due to an unreliable national electricity grid, made local manufacturing commercially unviable for these firms. This highlights a critical issue regarding the quality of capital entering the country. While foreign inflows have returned, an analysis of the capital import data reveals that over 85% of these funds are not entering long-term, employment-generating foreign direct investment. Instead, they consist of short-term portfolio investments, commonly referred to as hot money. Foreign institutional investors are simply taking advantage of Nigeria's record-high interest rates, parking capital in short-term government bonds and treasury bills to harvest high yields, with the intention of pulling that capital out the moment global market dynamics shift. Concurrently, the critical agricultural sector remains deeply constrained. Agriculture employs the vast majority of the population and is vital for sustainable food security, yet it is severely depressed by systemic security challenges. Widespread rural insecurity, localized agrarian conflicts, and organized criminal syndicates operating across key agricultural belts have created a landscape where farmers cannot safely access land or transport yields. This supply-side disruption keeps food prices at an exceptionally high plateau, long after statistical core inflation has begun to moderate. Finally, the fiscal space available to remedy these issues remains intensely restricted. Although removing the fuel subsidy saved the state trillions of naira in nominal terms, an overwhelming percentage of public revenue collection is still absorbed by debt servicing obligations inherited from a decade of aggressive fiscal borrowing. This leaves the federal and state governments with minimal capital to execute the deep, transformative investments required in transport infrastructure, healthcare, public education, and security grid stabilization. When you synthesize the data, the objective conclusion is clear. Nigeria's economy is no longer asleep, but its awakening is far from a triumphant success story. It is a deeply fragile, highly volatile structural transition. The painful reforms executed over the last few years were mathematically necessary to prevent a total sovereign debt collapse. They have successfully established a more transparent, market-driven macroeconomic foundation. The return of institutional foreign capital, the recovery of external reserves, and the organic expansion of the digital services sector show that the core economic engine is operational. However, this progress currently rests on a precarious social contract. Macroeconomic data points mean nothing to a population experiencing severe food insecurity and a near-total destruction of household purchasing power. If the state cannot rapidly convert its newly achieved macro stability into microeconomic relief, specifically by lowering capital costs for local manufacturers, resolving rural insecurity to stabilize agricultural output, and reducing the regulatory friction choking small businesses, the risks of profound social discontent and sudden policy reversals will remain dangerously high. Nigeria has successfully demonstrated to the global market that it possesses the political capacity to endure harsh economic surgery. It has yet to prove that it can translate that surgery into actual, inclusive human prosperity.